Welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for the Arrival of Electronic Truck Inspections, presented as public service to the trucking industry by PrePass, the leading way station bypass and integrated electronic toll payment service provider in North America. I'm Manuela Colis, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. Our speaker today is Steve Vaughn, Senior Vice President of Field Operations at PrePass Safety Alliance, the nonprofit provider of PrePass services. Steve served nearly 30 years with the California Highway Patrol, including as Chief of the Enforcement Services Division, and is a past president of the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. Now I'll hand it off to Steve.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today to the webinar, Preparing for Arrival of Electronic Truck Inspections. There's several things we'll cover today. There will be an opportunity to ask some questions, and I'll respond to those at the end of the presentation. I'd like to start with giving you a little bit of background on where we have been and where we are looking to go. UID today is known as the Universal Electronic Identification. In the past, some of you may have known it as the Universal ID. And that really got started back in the early 2000s. It was first addressed by CVSA. And what they were looking to do at that time was be able to identify trucks as they were coming down the road. There was a great deal of discussion about this over the years, and in July of 2010, CVSA petitioned FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, for a rulemaking asking that become a requirement of commercial motor vehicles. FMCSA did a review on that, and in May of 2013 denied the CVSA petition. About that same time, there was a great deal of discussion about how we would do electronic inspections. And in May of 2013, in February of 2015, CVSA asked FMCSA to reconsider its denial, and at that time, they did in fact reverse their decision. It was in 2017 that the level 8 was passed in CVSA, and an entire new level, which was the electronic roadside inspections. So that comes in between 2015 and September and 2022. FMCSA issued a unique identifier, an advance notice of preliminary rulemaking. And what that is, if you're not familiar with it, is something that FMCSA or some of the federal agencies will do when considering a rulemaking, will put out information and seek input from industry, the states, anyone that wishes to provide input and get involved in the discussion. We'll talk a little bit more about the ANPRM in a few minutes, but first, let's talk a little bit about what has been done to develop a unique electronic identification. There was a group of individuals with commercial motor vehicle industries, state representatives, and CVSA that had discussions. And as a result of those discussions, came up with something that they thought would fit as that identifier. And there was a UID study proposed in the Senate Amendment to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, in 2021. And that was a result of those discussions that took place and then was discussed with Senate members. In that, what they were looking for was a commercial motor vehicle enforcement and trucking industry. The shareholders agreed that what would be a good identifier would be a vehicle identification number, many of you know as the VIN. And what they were looking for were three specific elements. identifies the vehicle for compliance, inspection, and enforcement purposes. 2, that it does not transmit personally identifiable information regarding the operators, a real concern for many drivers. And 3, does not create an undue cost or burden for operators and carriers, and quite frankly, for the states as well. Although the amendment did get in there, it did not appear in the final legislation that was signed into law. Jump ahead a little bit. I'm going to come back to UID and how it fits into this picture, but first I want everyone to have a clear understanding of what the CVSA Standard Level 8 electronic inspection is. It is an inspection that's done electronically as the truck is coming down the road and in motion without ever interacting with an enforcement officer. So as the truck's coming down the road, information is sent forward to the facility, or in some cases in mobile units, identifying that truck and giving it pertinent information, and they can determine, do I want to take a closer look at this vehicle or not? Data exchange must include several elements. They are required for it to be an official level 8, and we're going to talk about what those are. Some of the items that are going to be required as part of the level 8 inspection is hours of service compliance, most likely coming from the ELD or other type of provided service that's provided there. US DOT or the NSC, which is the Canadian number. Power unit registration, is it current? And information regarding who it's registered to. The operating authority, generally the DOT number. The Unified Carrier Registration, UCR, and if there are any federal out-of-service orders against that DOT number. Also required is a descriptive location, including the GPS coordinates. They want to know exactly where that vehicle is. Electronic validation of who's operating the vehicle. Driver's license class and endorsements for the vehicle being operated. Is the driver qualified to operate that type of vehicle? The commercial vehicle license status, medical examiner certificate and skilled performance evaluation certificate, and current driver's record of duty status. Those are all elements that would be transmitted or need to be transmitted forward for it to be a valid CVSA Level 8 inspection. I talked about the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, the UID. This was something that FMCSA did. They looked at the information that CVSA provided and others had provided as input, and they were going to issue a rulemaking, possibly, but the advance notice was came out, it was published in September of 2022. They were looking for comments from industry reps, state reps, anyone that, again, wished to participate and provide input. And one of the challenges was, instead of looking at just what we discussed as part of the UID, that did make that amendment, it went well beyond the scope of just a universal identifier. It included elements which could be perceived as being part of a level 8 inspection or an electronic inspection as the vehicle's traveling down the road, and actually some elements of items that are being included in discussions on commercial motor vehicles that are autonomous. So it did create some confusion. It did, in fact, generate a large number of comments that came in. And now it's the responsibility of FMCSA to review those comments and come out with an actual rulemaking or decide how they want to proceed at this point. In the proposed rulemaking, there were a large number of unanswered questions. These are things that we've heard throughout the industry, both on the carrier side and on the state side. And one of the first is, how would a UID actually improve highway safety? Now, FMCSA is an organization that their main focus is on enhancing highway safety on our highways, primarily through regulations and safety programs. So their actions in this are something that is honorable. They're trying to improve safety on the highways. But the question is, simply identifying a vehicle, how would it actually improve? Statistics have shown it's generally drivers and driving behaviors that cause accidents. In today's world, you find a much smaller number of accidents that are caused by mechanical failures on the truck. So what are we trying to achieve by coming up with the UID? I think that can be answered, but I also believe it needs to be answered before we move forward. How would a carrier and driver data be transmitted and received? Today, we don't have a solid means to send that information forward, nor do enforcement agencies have a means to accept it for the most part. How would data transmission and data storage be protected? This is a huge question. With cyber crimes that occur as they do today, we know that whatever information that's being transmitted in an open format must be or is susceptible to being intercepted. We also know that the storage, we hear stories every single day of material being, programs being hacked, getting access to data that's being stored in locations. So there are safety protocols, there are security protocols that are established, but I think before we move forward, are those going to be established so that we're all operating on the same page? How would data be used after carriers provide it to federal and state governments? This is also a huge concern with many agencies. As a former state employee, I know we received a large number of FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act, requesting information. As a state agency, that information in many cases has to be provided. So that is a concern for many. And how are we going to protect that, ensure that the information that's being transmitted and stored is not used for against carriers or in an inappropriate fashion? How will the new mandate on carrier and driver data impact the trucking industry? A big concern with the trucking industry today, as many of you know, is driver recruitment and retention. There are concerns by some drivers that that information may be exposed. A recent survey shows that 27% of the respondents indicated they would leave the industry if such a law was required. Now, realistically, we know that in many surveys, people will answer one way. How they will behave later when they look at the actual need to continue to provide for their family, they may not act on that. But there is a concern out there by industry of how the drivers would react. Another is available parking for out-of-service vehicles. I think as a former state person, this is something that concerns me, not only with the parking availability, that is a concern industry-wide today. Where are drivers able to park once their hours of service are expired or getting near expiration? So this is a concern that if we look at industry today, currently 1% to 2% of all vehicles traveling down the road are in fact receive a CVSA inspection of some sort. It's a very small number. Of those, 5 to 7% on average, drivers are placed out of service for some type of violation. Vehicles, somewhere between 20 and 25% are placed out of service for issues with the vehicle. If much of this or a part of this becomes an electronic inspection as the vehicle's driving down the road, where are we going to park those vehicles? What is it going to do to interstate commerce and our supply chain? Those are things that obviously we're looking to enhance safety and make the roadways safer, but we need to address some of these unanswered questions before we move forward. Will states be held liable unless every truck in violation is declared or detained? Again, as a former state person, once I become aware of a violation, there's an expectation that I take action on it. And as it stands today in the commercial enforcement arena, we are short enforcement officers. Nearly every state in the nation is short. We're not able to keep up with the demand today. This is only going to increase that. Being from California, real concern of liability. Will the state get sued if something occurs further down the road and we had not acted on the information we received electronically? Also, related to that, I hear carriers frequently ask, will we be notified? My driver may be doing something I'm not aware of. Will I be notified that there's some type of a violation? Because if that driver does in fact continue, will the carrier become liable for any type of event that may occur later on? And one that's been around for quite a while is, will motor carriers what will they receive in return for providing the additional data as it's going down the road? Many of you have heard of this as beyond compliance. There's been discussions as far back as CSA 2010. When are we going to get credit for things that we do, such as driving down the road and having this level 8 inspection? And that's something that's being discussed, but we haven't got a definitive answer yet today. Data use. One of the things here is what data should be included as part of that electronic ID. Again, VIN number seems to be good for the vehicle. Do we really need to transmit things such as the carrier name, carrier contact information, truck ID, license plate, or simply giving them a VIN? Will that be sufficient? And the reason that is important is because governmental agencies with a VIN can then get all the information that, instead of transmitting it in an open form, they can actually access that through the VIN number through various federal and state systems. Another concern is building out an entirely new system and technology to transmit the VIN would probably be prohibitively expensive to install and would be a burden on state budgets to maintain and update. There is a large cost whenever you're talking about putting this information in every facility so that they can receive the information, and the question becomes, who's going to pay for it? Broadening the scope of information to include driver PII would take a disastrous toll on supply chain. As we indicated, that there is an indication through surveys that some drivers will leave the industry. And then once the government has GPS location with a timestamp and can track trucks, can it be used for data to implement a VMT tax, a vehicle mile tax, based on where that vehicle is actually traveling? So going back to the unanswered questions, how are we going to address these things? How well are they going to be defined prior to implementing any program? Data transmission. One of the questions that came up in the advance notice was, should FMCSA propose a standard for the method of data transmission? And if so, do you believe it should be a voluntary standard that can be developed? So I think most people believe the answer to that is yes. That standard should be established so that everyone going into it, whether it be telematic provider, a bypass service, any other type of service out there that has the capability to transmit this information, knows exactly what they need to do and what they need to provide, and in what format, what the security protocols are going to be to make sure that it works. Another question that has come up is this going to be a voluntary program, or is this going to be a mandatory program? Initially, it was discussed as a voluntary program. As you get deeper and more involved in the discussions, I think people realize that it's probably going to end up as a mandatory program, which will probably be, is necessary to be equitable to all. Then the question becomes, who's going to pay for that part of it for the carriers? Carriers that can't afford new trucks, OEM, the UID device will probably become part of that. And so that the larger carriers that can afford to buy new trucks on a more frequent basis, if it becomes mandatory, will have that equipment on the vehicle and may receive more bypasses versus those carriers that can't afford the new equipment and would be required to either add it or may be subject to being pulled in to get that additional information in the more traditional means. Data protection. Again, this is very large. What are the cybersecurity issues? We're talking about spoofing, some type of interference that prevents that signal from reaching the intended target. Should FMCSA consider that when we talk about the electronic ID proposal? Today, many companies have a difficult time, small, medium, even large trucking industry carriers have difficulty securing their on-site computer systems. We've seen breaches in federal government databases that we thought were very secure. When it comes down to individual companies, smaller entities that don't have the resources to make sure that that is in place, it could be a costly endeavor. Therefore, I think we need to clearly define what those protocols are going to be. In any type of transmission, when you're talking about UID or a level 8 data transmission, there needs to be some type of sophisticated encryption system in place. And again, these are all topics that come up during discussions, whether it is through industry groups or CVSA or committees that have been established to determine this. Transmitting driver PII as a truck travels down the highway creates a fairly significant risk to privacy. Again, cybersecurity is going to be the key on this. Once FMC determines the method of transmission, as we know, and we have seen every time there's a new regulation such as ELDs, the truly bad actors will find a way to infiltrate it and intercept it. So therefore, it needs to make sure that it is extremely secure at the front end and well-defined so that all of us can get involved and make sure that we're meeting the protocols that have been established. Probably, again, as a former state individual, one of mine is, what is the cost of electronic ID equipment for states, carriers, and drivers? I can tell you as a pre-clearance program provider, it is extremely expensive to put some of this equipment in place. Existing pre-clearance programs today have an inexpensive way to address it with motor carriers. According to FMCSA research, a motor carrier saves about $8.68 every time it bypasses a weigh station. So that cost could be absorbed very quickly. The concern by many state officials that I talked to is that the states would bear the cost to build, maintain, and upgrade any type of UID system or a level 8 system. And it's something that is a very large concern. Although grants are available to do some of this, generally speaking, once you get the program in place and as you're moving along, there's a significant cost to store the data, make sure it's maintained properly and secure, and also maintain the equipment itself. I can tell you the PrePass Safety Alliance has invested over $975 million to build and maintain one of the world's largest connected vehicle infrastructures. This is paid for by industry today. With any of the other programs moving forward, those are going to be tax dollars, or other means are going to have to be developed to absorb the cost by the states as they move forward, and the carriers. We talk about what are the safety benefits as we move forward with electronic IDs. Identifying a truck has not clearly been defined what the safety benefit is today. That's something that will need to be addressed. UID would increase the number, or could increase the number of trucks entering weigh stations. As I mentioned, 24% of the trucks out there today are placed out of service. If there's information that there is a problem with a truck on the road, that's going to come in for a closer inspection. It will most likely have to be verified by an officer. And as I mentioned before, there are shortages today. Sites that I visit in the past would have 5 or 6 officers or enforcement personnel at those locations, are down to 1 and 2 in many cases. There's just shortages. Resources are low in law enforcement today. One of the first spots they tend to move towards to pull enforcement people out to place for regular patrol is the commercial motor vehicle programs. Matching the identity of a truck to a federal state systems would offer limited safety benefit in a UID program. Again, pre-clearance programs do that today. We identify it. All the information is put up on the screen for the officers or the enforcement personnel in the facility, so it's clearly defined. The vast majority of crashes involved in commercial vehicles, or as I mentioned today, are unsafe driver behavior. Going back to what I said earlier, it's the drivers, that's where the focus needs to be. And in 75% of the crashes involving a commercial motor vehicle, it's the passenger vehicle that causes the accident or the crash. Therefore, we need to really identify where does the focus need to be. And I think that is something as we move forward, and I hit a couple of the next slides, we will talk about that more. In March of 2023, CVSA held a Level 8 forum. It was in Omaha, Nebraska. Very good turnout. There was some fantastic discussion that took place there. There was approximately 150 federal, state, and industry people that attended. Some of the key discussion points were, is it going to be a voluntary program or a mandatory program as discussed before? Again, many of the voluntary programs we've seen in the past, whether it's at a state level or a federal level, become mandatory. ELDs are probably the most recent example that I could think of. Do we need to redefine the current definition? I went over what is required for a Level 8 inspection today. As we were moving forward in those discussions, we recognized there were other things that may need to be included. So the Level 8, CVSA Level 8 definition may need to be revised. That's, again, further discussion, and that's something that CVSA is going to have to determine as they move forward. Should it be implemented in phases? I think we've recognized, and it was based on the discussion at the forum, the answer to that is yes. We need to identify one phase at a time. The discussion at that point in March, really focused in on the driver. So we may see first phase being considered, maybe driver information being sent forward and identify, is the driver qualified? Are they compliant in everything that they need to be? Should sensors on vehicles, equipment be included? Currently, the information has more to do with credentials with the vehicle. There was a great deal of discussion of taking on some of the elements that are currently in autonomous vehicles. Do we tap into the onboard computer to identify parts that are failing on the system? And then one of the discussions that came up was currently it's defined and we're talking about the tractor. What about trailers? Do we include that? Is some of that equipment required to be addressed as well? Inspection software integration, how do we bring it all together to be more efficient for roadside personnel, which then will translate to more efficiency for the carriers? They're not going to be delayed while the officers are putting the information in manually. How do we transfer that information from roadside on up to databases, which can be accessed at a larger level, such as the federal level? Cybersecurity was a very big concern in the discussions that took place there. And finally, smart trailers. As smart trailers are becoming more commonplace, should we be collecting the information from those to determine, is the vehicle safe to continue? Current status, CVSA has a level 8 ad hoc committee, which is working with FMCSA representatives to address the concerns identified at the forum and through the notice of preliminary rulemaking. And they are currently asking for participation for a pilot of some sort. The committee consists of members from both the trucking industry, state and federal agencies, industry, and technology providers. So it is a diversified group of individuals. We're able to discuss many different items and understand where the other parties are coming from as we have these discussions. It appears they will be conducting a pilot on one portion of this inspection, as I just said, most likely driver requirements. While the program will initially be voluntary, based on the discussion, once again, it appears that it may become mandatory over time. And again, it's something that will probably become necessary so that it'll be more equitable to all. And further discussions will take place with all the stakeholders to further define the process, the security aspects of the data exchange, and what elements of the commercial vehicle equipment should be included as part of the level 8 information going forward. One of the things I need to point out is you have UID was the unique identifier, level 8 is the inspection. Those are two separate individual items that are being addressed. However, the reality is that they need each other to make the highways safer. The only way a level 8 can actually occur is that they can positively identify the vehicle coming down the road. What I'm going to do now is see if we have any questions so I can respond to them more specifically, or any concerns anyone has that we can take down and share elsewhere.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. We do have some time remaining, and in just a moment, we will get to your questions. While we are getting them together, I want to remind you that this webinar is being sponsored by PrePass, the nation's premier way station bypass service provider. Only PrePass offers you a choice of bypass technologies, either with the transponder, the PrePass app, or both. The PrePass app works on iOS and Android devices or through a telematics or routing systems integrations. PrePass also provides electronic toll payment services, driver safety and productivity alerts, and easy-to-use carrier safety score and tolling dashboards. Visit PrePass online at prepass.com for more information. So let's go ahead and answer a few of those questions that came in. It seems like there are quite a few unanswered questions about UID and level 8 inspections. Will those be resolved before either or are, will those be resolved before either are implemented?
Excellent question. And that is a question probably better addressed to FMCSA. I would say that it appears that those questions need to be answered before we move forward with any type of program. We've all seen, both at the state level and federal level, programs that were initiated with the very honest intent of fixing some of the things that had not been completed once the program got implemented. We all know that when a new program goes in place, there are going to be some changes that are going to be required because of things that weren't considered. But for those questions that we have already been addressed or have been asked, I think it would be important to get those firm answers in place and become part of the program before it moves forward. But we don't know if they will be answered or not at this point.
Got it. So what if drivers change trucks? The driver's information isn't going to be on the PrePass. Wouldn't it make more sense if the driver information would be on the e-log? The question that we got in.
The information, drivers will change trucks. So that is why it's going to become important that once we establish what is the requirement, driver information that's going to be sent forward. Once it's firmly established, anybody that is going to participate in the level 8 and provide that information forward will know exactly what they need to provide, whether it's a PrePass program, other service providers, telematic providers. So it will become an important element to transferring information forward. But first, the question needs to be answered. What is going to be required? How are we going to safely transfer that information forward? And how are we going to make sure that the data is secure?
Got it. Now we have somebody asking, when do you think the requirement will be mandated?
Again, that's a question for FMCSA. I believe on their schedule, it is indicated that will be towards the latter part of this year. But with the volume of responses that came in, I would think that it's going to take them a little bit more time to evaluate the entire notice of preliminary rulemaking that they sent out and what that requirement will actually be. I cannot address the actual rulemaking and what they intend on doing based on discussions that have taken place, whether it is committees within industry groups, associations, CVSA. I would think that possibly in 2024, we may see a pilot, we may see some testing. But before anything is definitively mandated, I think we're looking a couple years out.
All right. How will they positively identify and encrypt the data on each truck, trailer, and tractor is a big concern. So, bit of a question and comment at the same time there.
It is, and that is a concern that's shared by many. And again, it needs to be addressed before we start transferring any of that information forward.
Looking at the elements of Level 8 inspections, it appears to be more about collecting data. What are the safety benefits of UID and Level 8?
That's an excellent point. One of the concerns that has always been out there is how much information is being collected on carriers. When you talk to industry reps, they don't want their competitors to know what their routes are, who their customers are, who their drivers are. It is something that needs to be maintained by that carrier individual trucker. So as this information is sent out, there is a real concern of what is the security of it? How is it going to be protected? Who is going to have access to it? Those are some very real concerns that need to be, again, addressed before we start transmitting that information and getting it out there.
It appears a great deal of vehicle and driver information is being provided to law enforcement at roadside facilities. How will it be protected during the transmission of the information, and how will it be used once it is obtained?
Another great question. Cybersecurity is going to be very important in how we transmit that information. There should probably be a single protocol for security purposes that we are all aware of what those requirements are, and then we can address it as individual companies. How the information is used once it gets there is, again, going back to the previous answer, it's always a concern of how it's going to be used. What will law enforcement do with it? I will tell you that we have well over 550 sites around the nation. Over the past 10 years, I've been to the majority of them. When I go into the facilities and I watch the enforcement personnel, the inspectors actually working there at the facility, they don't have a lot of time to go through all that information. For the most part, what they're doing is they're watching the truck come down the lane, go over the static scale, they're watching the weight, they're looking to see if it has a CVSA sticker, are there any noticeable major issues with that truck? And then it drives right on through. They're not looking at the data. They really don't have the time to do so. So how is it used after that? I think for the most part, it's stored. Much of the information that is, I think, used by states today is to determine what is the traffic volume during certain days, times of the day, what are the configurations, what are the weights, so that they can determine what type of enforcement they need to put in place, what days, what times. Beyond that, individual trucks that come across those facilities, you really don't have time to jump into it and start digging around to find out what you have. Shortage of personnel, a large number of responsibilities for these folks. They simply can't do it.
Will the ability for a truck to transmit the required information be based on new vehicles manufactured, or its carriers need to retrofit existing trucks? They're also asking, what is the cost for the carrier, and will they be expected to cover that cost, or will the equipment be supplied by the federal government?
Again, that is undetermined. The likelihood that the federal government will have the funding to provide that equipment to the carriers is very unlikely. The likelihood that the federal government will have the money to actually supply all the money required for the states to put the equipment in place is unlikely. So it is, yes, I think it'll be the burden of the carriers and much of it of the states to cover that cost. Now, will new vehicles be required to have that as part of their, when they manufacture the vehicle, it needs to be part? That is something that really would fall under NHTSA, who does the regulations for the manufacturers on what's required. They address more the safety items on vehicles. And it's really, it would be a matter of how they define this. Is it a safety item that's going to be required on the vehicle? Will NHTSA take that up? I don't know if FMCSA can do that through a rulemaking. I don't believe they can, but that would be a question for FMCSA.
I have somebody else asking, how accurate will the inspections be?
That was another concern that was voiced at the forum. We had a couple carriers stand up and say, hey, people today are using my DOT number. I'm constantly going in to have something corrected because someone used my DOT number and it was not, in fact, my truck. They have to go into data queues and start with that and then maybe pursue it elsewhere. So it all depends on how the system is defined. Will it be something that's taken directly off the onboard computer to verify that that truck is the one that's being identified as it's coming down the road? And then as for the drivers, are there going to be some type of requirements that a facial recognition be used to verify that the person operating the vehicle is actually the one with that's logged in as the using the driver's license? So those are all questions that need to be answered and defined in the system.
Since the ELD already contains most of the P2 data needed for a CVSA inspection level 8, why wouldn't the FMCSA just leverage that technology and require the ELD to provide that information rather than setting up a new piece of equipment?
I think FMCSA, again, their goal is to enhance safety on the roadway. So they're doing everything they can to take all this feedback that comes in. These are questions that FMCSA will have to address. And there are, I think in the discussions, they're finding that there are already service providers out there, such as PrePass and others, that are going to be a vital part of transmitting that information. It's already on the vehicles. It's already part of the system. I think they're going to have to take a much closer look at how they want to put this program in place and utilize existing technologies to enhance safety in the future.
Will the DOT inspections be uploaded on PrePass? And if yes, are the inspections going to have to come from any service provider or a particular one?
Again, that's undefined. That is something that they're going to have to address when they put this forward. Typically, any information on inspections that are going forward need to come from the states or a CVSA certified program. So that's an excellent question that I can't answer.
All right. I do have a few people asking if a copy of this presentation will be emailed once the webinar is over. You can revisit and rewatch this webinar with the same link that you used today, and we will also send a copy of the recording. So if you want to watch back any of this, feel free to do so. We'll go ahead and take one more question before we wrap up. How would the automized system know if either the truck or trailer have a mechanical issue that has not been recognized or addressed yet? For example, a faulty bulb.
That is not necessarily being addressed in level 8. It is being addressed more in the autonomous vehicle discussions that are taking place. The onboard computer, you could put sensors on various parts of the vehicle, such as the brakes, lighting systems, which will determine that it works properly before the vehicle leaves. If there's a malfunction, the intent is with autonomous vehicles is if there's a malfunction as the vehicle's going down the road, as that information is being transmitted forward, it will identify that for the carrier and for the enforcement personnel roadside. But it's in the early stages of discussion on level 8, I believe, on how much. When I mentioned earlier that do we redefine level 8? Will CVSA do that? Those are the sort of questions as to what will become part of the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering those questions, Steve. Now, that is all of the time that we have for today. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar. I want to thank Steve and PrePass for today's presentation. I also want to mention that this webinar will be available on demand on the Heavy Duty Trucking website at truckinginfo.com/webinars, as well as in the resource library at prepass.com. Thank you for attending today's webinar.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you all for attending.